Hello, sleepy detectives, and welcome back. I know you're here to settle in and relax, so if you enjoy these stories, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I love knowing where our community is. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let's get comfortable and jump straight into tonight's story. We often believe that every mystery has an answer, that every puzzle has a solution, that if we just look hard enough, the chaotic facts will eventually align into a neat, understandable story. But on a quiet Australian beach over 70 years ago, a discovery was made that defies this fundamental human need for order. It is a case that is not a whodunit, but a what happened. It is a story with no beginning, no clear middle, and an ending written in a language no one can read. This is the story of the Somerton Man and the psychological void he left behind. I love knowing where our community is. It's a comfort to know we're all settling in together from different corners of the world to try and make sense of these complex stories. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, as our screen begins to dim, let's settle in and begin. The morning of December 1st, 1948, began like any other on Somerton Beach near Adelaide, South Australia. The post-war summer was approaching. The air was calm. At approximately 6:30 a.m., a local jeweler named John Lyons was on a morning walk when he noticed something near the shoreline at the foot of a small seawall. It was a man. He was lying on his back, propped up against the wall as if resting, with his head tilted back. His legs were crossed. To Lyons, the man simply looked like someone who had spent the night on the beach, perhaps after a few too many drinks. He seemed asleep, undisturbed by the waves. But as the morning wore on, the man did not move. By 7 a.m., another couple walking the beach saw the man in the same position. They too assumed he was sleeping off a long night. It wasn't until later that morning, when the man's stillness became unsettling, that authorities were finally called. When police arrived, they realized this was not a man sleeping. He was cold. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The discovery of a body is always a tragedy, but the examination of this man, both on the beach and later at the morgue, is where this case fractures from tragedy and enters the realm of the truly anomalous. This is where the impossible facts begin. The first impossible fact, the autopsy. The man was brought to the Royal Adelaide Hospital for a post-mortem examination. The pathologist, Dr. John Dwyer, began his work and immediately ran into a series of baffling contradictions. The man was in peak physical condition. He was about 5 feet 11 inches tall, in his early 40s, with broad shoulders and strong calf muscles. His hands were clean and manicured, showing no signs of manual labor. His shoes, oddly, were immaculate, despite him supposedly having walked on a sandy, damp beach. But the cause of his passing was a void. Dr. Dwyer found no evidence of violence. No stab wounds, no bullet holes, no blunt force trauma. He also found no natural cause. The man's heart was healthy. There was no sign of a stroke or aneurysm. The pathologist did find, however, a series of disturbing internal clues. The man's stomach contained a small amount of blood. His organs, particularly his liver and spleen, were congested and enlarged. These are classic signs of poisoning. Dr. Dwyer, and later the esteemed pathologist Sir Cedric Stanton Hicks, concluded that the man had almost certainly perished from a powerful, fast-acting poison. But here is the contradiction. They could not find a trace of it. Whatever had been used to end this man's life was either so obscure that it was unknown to 1940s toxicology, or it had metabolized so completely that it left no chemical signature. It was the perfect, untraceable act. The second impossible fact, the identity. If police could not determine how he passed away, they hoped to at least determine who he was. This effort also led to a dead end, but one that seemed deliberately constructed. The man had no wallet, no identification, no money. His clothing, however, was of high quality. He wore a white shirt, a fashionable red, white, and blue tie, a brown knitted pullover, and a sophisticated, double-breasted brown suit jacket. But when detectives looked for labels, they found the second impossible fact. Every single tag on every piece of his clothing had been meticulously cut off. The tailor's name from his suit, the brand from his tie, the laundry mark from his shirt. Someone had systematically erased his identity, right down to the fabric. This was not a robbery. This was an erasure. A fingerprint expert, Detective William Spry, was brought in. The man's prints were taken and sent across Australia, and then to the entire English-speaking world, the UK, the US, and Canada. The response from every bureau, including the FBI, was the same: no match. This man, in the prime of his life, with immaculate hands and expensive clothes, did not officially exist. The third impossible fact: the luggage. The investigation stalled. The man was a ghost. Police were left with only one theory: the man must have traveled to Adelaide. They checked the luggage rooms of the local railway station, and on January 12, 1949, 6 weeks after the body was found, they found it: a brown suitcase. It had been checked into the station's cloakroom on November 30th, the day before the man was found on the beach. And just like the man's clothing, the luggage tag had been removed. Police opened the suitcase, hoping to find answers. Instead, they found only deeper questions. Inside was a collection of high-quality clothes, a dressing gown, slippers, underwear. But just like the clothes on the body, most of the labels had been cut out. And then, the anomalies. The police found a small stencil kit, the kind used by officers on merchant ships to label cargo. They found a table knife that had been filed down into a sharp point. They found a small spool of orange-colored Barber brand thread. This last item was the only thing that tied the suitcase to the man. The pockets of the suit he was wearing had been repaired, using the exact same unusual orange thread. But there was one final, baffling clue inside the suitcase. While most labels were gone, 3 items, a tie, a laundry bag, and a singlet, bore a name: T. Keene. This, police thought, was the breakthrough. They searched every missing person record in the English-speaking world for a T. Keene. They found nothing. And a subsequent check revealed that none of the remaining dry cleaning marks on the clothes matched any laundry in South Australia. The Keene lead was a dead end. We must pause here and ask a psychological question, our first mystery seed. Why would someone meticulously cut most of the labels but deliberately leave 3 bearing the name Keene? Was it a mistake? Or was it a deliberate piece of misdirection, a false flag designed to send investigators down a rabbit hole? The case was now more confusing than when it began. We had an unknown man, dead from an unknown poison, with an unknown identity, who had checked in a suitcase filled with false leads and strange tools. But the case's most defining clue was yet to be found, and it was hiding in plain sight. The fourth impossible fact: Tamam Shud. Months passed. The investigation was cold. The unknown man had been embalmed to preserve his remains while the police waited for a miracle. In April 1949, nearly 5 months after the discovery, the pathologists decided to conduct one last thorough examination before the man was finally buried. They checked his pockets one more time, and this time the pathologist, Dr. John Cleland, felt something. Hidden deep within a small, obscure fob pocket inside the man's trousers, a pocket that had been missed by everyone, was a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper. He unrolled it. On it were two printed words in an elegant, ornate font. Tamam Shud. Police were baffled. They sent the scrap to linguists, historians, and librarians. A local journalist finally identified it. It was not a note, it was a fragment. The words were Persian, meaning "it is ended" or "the end," and they were the final two words from a specific, rare book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. This was the case's central psychological seed. Was this a suicide note? A final, poetic declaration that it is ended? Or was it something else? A nationwide police search was launched, not for a man, but for the specific copy of the Rubaiyat that was missing this final page. The official investigation was immediate, but the facts didn't add up. Was this a crime, an accident, or something else? The discovery of the Tamam Shud scrap transformed the case from a local anomaly into a national obsession. The police now had two distinct theories, two narrative paths that led in wildly different directions. The first was the path of a tragic, personal drama. The second, the path of a dark, international conspiracy. Theory 1. The rational, the jilted lover, suicide. This theory is grounded in the words Tamam Shud, it is ended. To the police, this seemed like the most logical explanation. The man had ended his own life, or had been given poison by a lover in a suicide pact, and had chosen a poetic final statement. The case, in this light, was not a murder, but a tragedy of a broken heart. This theory gained immense traction when police found the exact book from which the scrap had been torn. After a public appeal, a man came forward. He said that on November 30th, the day before the man was found, and the same day the Keene suitcase was checked, he had found a rare copy of the Rubaiyat in the back of his unlocked car, which he had parked near Somerton Beach. He thought nothing of it and tossed it into his glove compartment. He only realized its significance when he read about the Tamam Shud scrap in the paper. He turned the book over to police. It was a 1941 edition, translated by Edward Fitzgerald. When experts examined the back page, they found a tear. The scrap from the dead man's pocket was a perfect match. This was the smoking gun. This book belonged to the Somerton man. Police scoured the book, desperate for answers, and in the back, they found them. Faintly penciled on the back page were two new clues. First, there was a phone number. Second, there was what appeared to be a coded message. 5 lines of capital letters with one line crossed out. The lover theory exploded. Police immediately traced the phone number. It belonged to a woman named Jessica Jo Thompson, a former nurse who lived just a few hundred yards from Somerton Beach, the very spot where the man was found. When Detective Lionel Liane brought the new evidence to Thompson, her reaction was, by all accounts, bizarre. He showed her a plaster bust that had been made of the dead man's face. According to Liane's reports, when Thompson saw the bust, she was completely taken aback, to the point where she appeared to be about to faint. She immediately averted her gaze and refused to look at it again. She admitted she knew the man. His name, she claimed, was Alf Boxall. She said Boxall was a man she had worked with at a hospital in Sydney during the war. She claimed he had once, strangely, given her a copy of the Rubaiyat as a gift. But she denied any current relationship. She was now married. She insisted she hadn't seen Boxall in years and had no idea what he was doing in Adelaide. To the police, this seemed like the solution. The Somerton man was Alf Boxall. He had traveled to Adelaide to see his old flame, Jessica Thompson. She, being married, had rejected him. Despondent, he walked to the beach, took poison, and passed away with her phone number and the Tamam Shud note as his final testament. It was a neat, tragic, and compelling story. The brick wall, the but. There was just one problem. Alf Boxall was not dead. In a stunning development, police in Sydney located Alf Boxall, alive and well, working at his job. And when they asked him about the Rubaiyat, he produced his copy, the one Jessica Thompson had mentioned. It was a 1924 edition, and, crucially, its back page was intact. It still had the words, Tamam Shud. The theory collapsed. Jessica Thompson's story was shattered. If the dead man wasn't Alf Boxall, why did she identify him as such? Why did she react so violently to the bust? And why did this other man, the Somerton man, have her unlisted phone number written in his book? The lover theory was dead. The case was back to a void. Theory 2, the exotic, the Cold War spy. With the rational explanation debunked, a new, more sinister theory emerged, one that persists to this day. The Somerton man was a spy. This theory reframes every single clue in a dark, new light. This was 1948. The Cold War was just beginning. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the West were escalating. And just 200 miles from Adelaide was Woomera, a highly classified, top-secret Anglo-Australian rocket testing range. It was a prime target for Soviet espionage. Look at the evidence again, this time through the professor lens of intelligence analysis. The poison. A sophisticated, untraceable poison is not the tool of a jilted lover. It is the tool of an intelligence agency. It is a clinical, professional execution designed to look like natural causes. The erasure. Meticulously cutting every label from his clothing is not an act of passion. It is an act of tradecraft. It is the systematic removal of all identifiers, a standard protocol for an agent operating in deep cover. The Keen clothes. The T. Keen name was not a mistake. It was a false flag. The stenciling kit suggests a naval connection, perhaps a submariner being inserted onto the coast. The code. The 5 lines of seemingly random letters in the back of the book were not poetic doodles. They were a one-time pad cipher. Naval intelligence experts at the time tried and failed to break it, suggesting it was highly sophisticated. For 70 years, codebreakers have tried and all have failed. Tamam Shud. This was not a suicide note. It was a signal. It was the sign, countersign for a dead drop. The book, left in the unlocked car, was the drop location. The scrap of paper in the man's fob pocket was the key, proving he was the agent. In this scenario, the Somerton man was a Soviet agent, or perhaps a Western counteragent who had arrived in Adelaide to meet a contact. That contact, perhaps the person he was supposed to meet at the beach, was a double agent. The meeting was a trap. He was poisoned, and his body was left as a grim warning. This spy theory explains the secrecy, the professionalism, and the clinical nature of the act. The brick wall, the butt. But this theory, too, hits a wall. Despite decades of searching, no intelligence agency, not the CIA, not MI6, not the KGB or its successor, the FSB, has ever acknowledged the man. His fingerprints, run through every database, yielded nothing. If he was a spy, he was the deepest ghost in history. The code remains unbroken. The motive remains pure speculation. And so, for 70 years, the case remained frozen in this perfect, balanced ambiguity. Was he a lover, or was he a spy? A victim of passion, or a casualty of the Cold War? With no theory fitting all the facts, the case file was closed. The Somerton man was buried in 1949 under a simple headstone that read, "Here lies the unknown man who was found on Somerton Beach." But the story was just beginning. The psychological void he left behind would captivate a new generation who would finally bring one shocking answer. The verdict was in. The trial was over. The case was unsolvable. Or was it? The files were closed, but the mystery endured. It was passed down from the original detectives to their children, from 1940s journalists to 21st century podcasters. The Somerton Man became less of a case and more of a campfire tale, a modern myth. But the case is unsolvable. So why, decades later, are we still obsessed with it? This is our USP. To understand the Somerton Man, we must first understand the psychology of the void he represents and the fundamental human fears he triggers. From the perspective of a psychologist, this case is a Rorschach test. We see in it what we fear most. Analysis 1. The fear of senselessness, the need for patterns. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. We are biologically hardwired to find meaning, to connect dots, to create a narrative. A leads to B leads to C. A case like this is terrifying because it defies a pattern. It is a collection of facts that refuse to connect. A man in perfect health who is dead. A man in expensive clothes with no identity. A man with immaculate shoes on a sandy beach. A suitcase full of clues that lead nowhere. A code that cannot be cracked. This is psychological chaos. It is senselessness. Our minds need to solve it because to leave it unsolved is to accept that the world can be random, chaotic, and meaningless. And that is a terrifying thought. This is why the spy theory is so popular. It is not popular because it is the most likely. It is popular because it is the most comforting. A vast, shadowy Cold War conspiracy is, psychologically, less scary than the idea that a man can simply be erased from the world for no reason at all. A secret code is preferable to random scribbles. A professional assassination is preferable to a meaningless, accidental death. The spy theory gives the Somerton Man's end meaning. It gives it purpose. It turns chaos into a complex but solvable order. Analysis 2. The fear of erasure, the Tamam Shud seed. Let's conduct a psychological investigation into the act of erasure itself. This is the payoff for our first mystery seed. Why cut the tags? If this was a murder, the spy theory holds the killer erased the man's identity to protect the mission. But if this was a suicide, the psychology is far darker and perhaps more profound. This is the psychology of anonymity. The man didn't just want to end his life. He wanted to end his existence. He wanted to become a void. This act suggests a complete and total detachment from self. He wasn't just severing his future, he was severing his past. By cutting the tags, he was methodically, clinically disconnecting himself from the world, from his history, from his very name. And this brings us to the Keen tags. From a psychological perspective, this is the most suspenseful clue. Why leave them? It wasn't a mistake. It was a final, complex psychological game. Possibility A, the misdirection. He wanted the police to chase a ghost. He wanted to create a puzzle. This is an act of intellectual superiority, a final battle of wits with the world he was leaving behind. He was in control, even in death. Possibility B, the ambivalence. Part of him wanted to be found. This is the classic cry for help paradox of many self-harm acts. He erased 90% of himself, but left 10%, a name, a breadcrumb, hoping someone would care enough to follow it. And this brings us to the Tamam Shud scrap. It is ended. It is the perfect, ambiguous symbol for this psychological state, a state of profound finality, of wanting to close the book, not just on a life, but on an identity. Analysis 3, the myth-making, the B-plot payoff. This case is a void, and psychologically, a void demands to be filled. This explains our B-plot, the public's obsession. When the facts are few, theories multiply. The Somerton Man became a blank canvas for our collective imagination. He became a myth. And for 74 years, he remained one. The case was a legend, a perfect, unsolvable puzzle, until the moment it wasn't. The case was cold, but the science was advancing. The B-plot of this story, the obsession of those left behind, continued into the 21st century. The central figure in this new investigation was a professor from Adelaide University named Derek Abbott. Abbott became fascinated by the case, not as a detective, but as a scientist. He saw it as the ultimate puzzle. He focused on Jessica Thompson, the nurse who had reacted so strangely to the bust. She had since passed away, but she had a son, Robin. Abbott theorized that Robin Thompson might be the unacknowledged son of the Somerton Man, a product of a secret wartime affair. This led Abbott down a complex path of genealogical research. He and his team began using modern DNA technology, a tool the 1948 detectives could not have dreamed of. They secured a few precious strands of the Somerton Man's hair, which had been recovered from the original plaster bust. For years, they worked to sequence the degraded, 70-year-old DNA. It was a painstaking, almost impossible task. And in July 2022, Derek Abbott and his colleague, the American genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, announced the impossible. They had a match. They had traced the Somerton Man's maternal line, built out a massive family tree of over 4,000 people, and finally triangulated a name. The ghost had a history. His name was not T. Keene. He was not a Russian spy. His name was Carl Charles Webb. He was born in 1905 in Melbourne, Australia. He was an electrical engineer and an instrument maker. Suddenly, the impossible facts were not so impossible. That strange stencil kit found in the suitcase? An electrical engineer and instrument maker would have used one for professional lettering. The spy code? Webb was known to be quiet, and he had a peculiar interest. He loved writing and betting on horse racing. The code, Abbott and others now theorize, may not have been a cipher at all, but a personal shorthand for his horse betting system. The T. Kane name? It was likely just a name on second-hand clothes he had bought. The simplest answer. The entire spy theory, the grand, complex, comforting narrative of a Cold War conspiracy, dissolved on contact with a simple human fact. This is the bridge, the tension release. The what and who are solved. The 74-year-old mystery is over. Or is it? The identification of Carl Webb, while monumental, does not solve the case. It deepens it. We now know who he was, but we still do not know why. Why did Carl Webb, a 43-year-old engineer, travel from Melbourne to Adelaide in 1948? Why did he systematically erase his own identity? Why did he have Jessica Thompson's unlisted phone number in his book? Research has since confirmed they were not related, leaving their connection a mystery. And the haunting echo, the final impossible fact that still has not been explained. Who ended his life? Was it a suicide? A tragic, lonely act by a man who loved poetry and betting on horses? Or was it something else? The identification of Carl Webb did not find a natural cause of death. The untraceable poison remains the central, chilling fact of the case. The Somerton Man is gone, but the mystery of Carl Webb has just begun. For 74 years, the Somerton Man was a perfect mystery. He was a void, a symbol of the unknown. In 2022, science gave him back his name, Carl Webb. This case is a profound reflection on our relationship with answers. We are a species that craves them. We invent vast conspiracies about spies and secret codes to avoid the simple, unsettling truth that a life can end senselessly on a quiet beach. But the story of Carl Webb is also a testament to the quiet, persistent human need to give the unknown a name. It is a story about the compassion of strangers like Derek Abbott, who worked for decades not to solve a crime, but to restore a man's identity. The Somerton man's grave is no longer that of an unknown, but the mystery of Tamam Shud, it is ended, remains. We may have solved the who, but we are, perhaps, further than ever from understanding the why. There are cases that chill us with their brutality. There are cases that fascinate us with their complexity. And then, there are cases that are something else entirely. They are not just crimes, they are dark fables, ghost stories made of fact. Tonight, we travel to a remote, snow-covered farm in 1920s Germany, to a place called Hinterkaifeck. It is a case that begins not with a crime, but with a whisper. It starts with the terrifying, unshakable feeling that you are no longer alone in your own home. It is a story that has no confirmed assailant, no clear motive, and no resolution. It is a perfect, dark mystery. The year is 1922. We are in the heart of Bavaria, Germany, in the small, rural hamlet of Kaifeck. The region is isolated, defined by thick forests and long, brutal winters. Here, set back more than half a mile from the nearest village, is the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck. The name itself means behind Kaifeck. It is a place on the edge of the world, a self-contained fortress of a house, a barn, and a stable, all connected by a single dark corridor. The farm is owned by the Gruber family. The patriarch is Andreas Gruber, 63, known in the village as a harsh, severe, and unpopular man. He lives with his wife, Katzilia, 72, who is frail and devout. With them lives their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35. And with Victoria live her two children, 7-year-old Katzilia and 2-year-old Josef. The family is isolated not just by geography, but by secrets. The village whispers about Andreas. They whisper that he is a tyrant. They whisper of a dark, rumored relationship within the family, one that may have resulted in the birth of young Josef. They are a family shrouded in rumor, living in a home shrouded in forest. The final resident is the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44. She has only been at the farm for a few hours. This is a crucial detail. The previous maid had fled the farm 6 months earlier. She claimed the house was haunted. She told neighbors she constantly heard footsteps in the attic and disembodied voices, and that she felt a presence. Andreas dismissed her as unstable. On Friday, March 31st, 1922, the timeline of this case begins to fracture. This is the last normal day. Victoria, a member of the church choir, is seen. Andreas is seen by neighbors. Young Katzilia is at school. But that afternoon, the psychological haunting that the previous maid described seems to return, this time with physical evidence. This is psychological seed number 1. Andreas Gruber, inspecting the perimeter of his property, discovers something that deeply unnerves him. In the fresh snow near the forest line, he finds a single set of footprints. They are the prints of heavy boots, leading from the dense woods, walking directly toward the farmhouse. He follows the tracks. They lead to the house. He searches the property, but finds no other set of prints. There are no tracks leading away from the farm. Someone had walked out of the forest, entered his property, and had not left. He tells neighbors about it later that day, his voice filled with agitation. That same night, the haunting escalates. He hears footsteps, clear and heavy, coming from the attic directly above the family's bedrooms. He grabs his rifle. He and Victoria search the entire attic. They search the lofts, the hay, the crawl spaces. They find nothing. The space is empty. But the next morning, another discovery. A set of house keys, which Andreas keeps in the workshop, has vanished. The haunting is no longer a feeling. It is an intruder. Someone has his keys. Someone is or was in his attic. Someone walked out of the woods and dissolved into the property. And one final, chilling detail is reported from that day. An unfamiliar newspaper, one that Andreas does not subscribe to, is found lying on the property. A sense of dread settles over the farm. Andreas is a man who trusts no one, and now he has proof that someone is watching him, toying with him, perhaps even living alongside him, hidden in the walls or the hay. But the family does not flee. They do not call the police. They are isolated, stubborn, and secretive. They decide to handle it themselves. That night, Friday, March 31st, 1922, the snow continues to fall. And then, silence. Saturday, April 1st, passes. No one sees the Grubers. This is not unusual. They are known recluses. Sunday, April 2nd, passes. Young Kazilia does not show up for choir practice. Victoria, the organist, is also absent. The villagers murmur, but it is not yet an alarm. Monday, April 3rd, passes. Young Kazilia does not go to school. The postman arrives. He notes that the mail from Saturday is still in the box, untouched. The snow around the house is undisturbed. By Tuesday, April 4th, the silence has become a suffocating, heavy blanket. A local mechanic, Albert Hofner, arrives to repair an engine. He stands at the farm for nearly an hour. He knocks on the door. He shouts. No one answers. The only sound is the lowing of the cattle, hungry in the barn. He reports the silence. The villagers, now truly afraid, form a small search party. It is led by a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer and two other men enter the property. They walk through the main house. It is cold, empty. The beds are undisturbed. In the kitchen, they see a meal has been recently prepared, but not finished. They walk through the dark central corridor that connects the house to the barn. Schlittenbauer slides open the heavy wooden door to the barn, and the haunting of Hinterkaifeck is over. The fracture is complete. The barn is dark, filled with the smell of hay and the nervous sounds of the animals. Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the other men lift their lanterns. The light falls on a scene of absolute clinical devastation. This is the forensic beat. Lying in the hay, partially covered by an old door, are 4 bodies. They have been stacked, almost piled, one on top of the other. The victims are Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and his granddaughter, 7-year-old Cecilia. The scene is compromised immediately. The men, in their shock, move the bodies, disturb the scene, and contaminate what little evidence may have existed. But what they report to the Munich police, who arrive hours later, is a portrait of a uniquely personal and brutal act. The weapon is not a gun, not a knife. It is a mattock, or a pickaxe, a heavy, long-handled farm tool. The autopsies, conducted later in the barn itself, would show that all victims perished from devastating blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with immense force. But the how is not the central mystery of this scene. The mystery is the sequence. This is psychological seed number 2. The investigators, led by Inspector Jörg Reingruber, begin to piece together the timeline, and what they find is psychologically baffling. They determine that the assailant, or assailants, did not launch a chaotic attack inside the house. Instead, it appears the killer lured them. The evidence suggests that on that Friday night, Andreas Gruber was the first to go. He was likely drawn out to the barn. perhaps by a noise he heard. A cow loose, a sound he mistook for the intruder he was already hunting. He was struck down. His life ended in an instant. Then, his wife, Kazilia, likely went to the barn to look for him. She, too, was slain. Then Victoria. She was next. Perhaps she called out for her parents, walked into the darkness, and met the same fate. And finally, little 7-year-old Kazilia. The evidence showed she had been alive for some time after the initial trauma. The autopsy found she had torn her own hair out in clumps, a sign of absolute, unimaginable terror, lying in the dark next to the remains of her family before she, too, perished. We must pause and ask the psychological question, how? How does one person with a heavy, clumsy farm tool manage to lure and dispatch 4 separate people, one by one, without any of them crying out? Without the others just yards away in the house hearing the struggle? It implies a chilling level of trust or manipulation. The killer was not just a brute. The killer was a psychological operator. He understood the family's habits. He knew how to draw them out, one by one, into the kill zone of the barn. Or perhaps he was not alone. The Munich police, searching the rest of the property, find the other 2 victims. In the house, in her bedroom, lies the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She was slain in her bed, struck down on what was likely her very first night of employment. In the nursery, in his own cot, lies 2-year-old Josef. He too has been slain by a single heavy blow. 6 people, an entire family, plus their new employee, erased from the world. And this is where the scene transitions from a brutal crime to a psychological void. This is psychological seed number 3, the central, haunting signature of the Hinterkaifeck case. As the search party and police examined the farm on that Tuesday, April 4th, they realized something was profoundly wrong. The murders, they determined, had happened on Friday, March 31st. This was 4 days earlier. But in those 4 intervening days, someone had been living at the farm. The evidence was undeniable. First, the cattle. The search party had heard them lowing. When they entered the barn, they found the cows had been recently fed. Someone had given them fresh hay and water after the bodies of the Grubers were lying just feet away. The farm dog, tied up outside, had also been given food. Second, the kitchen. The police found that meals had been recently cooked and eaten. Bread had been cut. Meat had been taken from the pantry. Third, the beds. While the victims' beds were cold, one of the beds in the house had been slept in recently. And finally, the chimney. Neighbors who had been interviewed now recalled seeing smoke rising from the farm's chimney all weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. This is the psychological signature of the case. The assailant did not flee. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a frenzied, chaotic act of passion. This was an execution, followed by a residency. The killer, or killers, after ending the lives of 6 people, including 2 children, proceeded to make the farm his home. For at least 3 days, this unknown individual lived alongside his victims. He stoked the fire for warmth. He cooked the family's food in their kitchen. He slept in their beds. And he calmly tended to their livestock, all while the family he had just slain lay frozen in the barn and in their rooms. This is the clinical weave of the B-plot. The community, the search party, was not just horrified by the act. They were psychologically shattered by the aftermath. They were confronted with a killer who felt no remorse, no panic, no need to flee. A killer who was so comfortable, so at home with his actions, that he simply took over the farm. This behavior is the brick wall in the investigation. It doesn't fit any simple category. It is the act of a ghost, a phantom who walked out of the woods, lived among them, committed an unspeakable act, and then, after 3 days, simply vanished. The hunt for the phantom of Hinterkaifeck began immediately, but it was, from the very first hour, a catastrophic failure. The scene, as we noted, was hopelessly contaminated. The search party, in their shock, had moved the bodies. Villagers, neighbors, and the morbidly curious had tramped through the house and barn for hours before the Munich detectives arrived, destroying any potential footprints, fingerprints, or clues. The investigation was trying to solve an impossible puzzle with half the pieces missing. The police were left with only 2 avenues: the weapon and the motive. The weapon, the mattock or pickaxe, was found in the barn, hidden. It was determined to belong to the Gruber farm itself. This was not an imported weapon. It was a tool taken from the victims. The motive, however, was a void. Robbery was almost immediately ruled out. A large amount of cash, jewelry, and valuable silver was found untouched in the house. This was not a crime of profit. This was a crime of what? Revenge? Passion? The investigation turned to the B-plot, the community itself. If the motive was personal, the killer was likely local. The police began to interview hundreds of people, building a list of suspects. Over the next several years, more than 100 people would be officially questioned. But the list always circled back to a few key individuals, none of whom fit perfectly. Suspect 1, Carl Gabriel, the dead husband. The first theory was a ghost from the past. This was Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who had been reported killed in action in the trenches of World War I nearly 8 years earlier. But his body had never been recovered. This theory suggested that Gabriel had not perished, that he had, perhaps, been a deserter or a prisoner of war and had finally returned home in 1922, only to find his wife in a rumored relationship and with a new child, Josef. In this scenario, the motive is a jealous rage, an honor killing by a shamed husband. It explains the brutality. But this theory hits a brick wall. While compelling, there was zero evidence. Multiple men from his regiment swore they saw him fall. And it doesn't explain the psychological signature. Why would a returning husband haunt the farm first? Why would he live there for days afterward? Suspect 2, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor. The investigation quickly focused on the man who had led the search party, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His connection to the family was deeply personal and very complicated. Schlittenbauer had been a close neighbor for years. After Carl Gabriel perished, he and the widow Victoria had begun a relationship. The village widely believed that he, not Andreas, was the true father of young Josef. He had wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas, the tyrannical patriarch, had forbidden it. The relationship ended badly. Schlittenbauer was a man with a known, public motive of spurned love and hatred for Andreas Gruber. His behavior on the day of the discovery was also highly suspicious. He led the search party, but he seemed to know his way around the farm almost too well. He was the one who entered the barn. He was the one who, by his own admission, immediately disturbed the bodies, claiming to check for signs of life. To the police, this looked like a man contaminating a scene he himself had created. This theory is psychologically compelling. A local man, familiar with the farm's layout, the animals, and the family. A man driven by rage. But again, the brick wall. The police could find no physical evidence linking him to the crime. And while he may have been capable of rage, was he capable of slaying his own 2-year-old son, Josef? And why, if he was the killer, would he lead the search party? It was a massive risk. The case stalled. The investigation was massive. They interviewed vagrants, traveling salesmen, and even former POWs. They even, in a desperate move, brought in psychics and clairvoyants to walk the farm. nothing. The trail went cold. The tension of the hunt was over. The physical evidence had led nowhere. The who was unsolved. The only thing left was the why. The only clues remaining were not forensic, they were psychological. The Munich police files were closed, but the case remained open in our collective minds. The trial left one question unanswered. Why? Why the haunting? Why the luring? Why stay for 3 days? The official motives, robbery, jealousy, feel thin. They don't explain the behavior. They don't explain the psychology. This is our specialty. To find the who, we must first build a profile of the why. We must conduct a psychological autopsy of the phantom himself, using the FBI agent or profiler lens. We are looking for a signature. And this case has 3 of the strangest signatures in criminal history. Payoff Seed 1. The psychology of the haunting, the footprints and attic. This is the key. The crime did not begin on Friday night. It began days, perhaps weeks earlier. The footprints in the snow, the sounds in the attic, the missing keys. This is not the behavior of a killer in a hot rage, like a jealous lover. This is the behavior of a cold, organized, and patient predator. This is a stalker. This individual was conducting surveillance. He was living in the attic or the hayloft, studying the family. This act of living unseen among the victims suggests several chilling psychological traits. A sense of entitlement. He felt he owned the farm. He wasn't just visiting, he was taking possession. Extreme detachment. He was able to view the Grubers not as people, but as objects to be observed. He was a scientist studying his specimens before dissection. The God complex. This behavior is about power. He is invisible. He holds their keys. He knows their routines. He is in complete control, and he revels in the psychological terror he is creating. The footsteps, the newspaper. He was haunting them because it was part of the thrill. Payoff Seed 2. The psychology of the luring, the barn. This brings us to the barn. How did he lure 4 people to their deaths, one by one? This act eliminates the disorganized killer, a transient, a lunatic. A disorganized killer would have attacked in the house, chaotically. This was organized. He had a plan. He was a patient trapper. The profiler lens suggests he used his knowledge from the surveillance phase. He knew Andreas was the guardian. He had to be eliminated first. So he created a lure that only Andreas would respond to. A sound in the barn, a loose cow. He used the man's own territorial nature against him. Once Andreas was gone, the rest of the lure was psychological. He likely called for them. He may have imitated Andreas's voice, or, more likely, he called out as if he were in trouble, drawing Cecilia, then Victoria, out to help. This is a confidence man killer. He didn't use force until the last second. He used manipulation. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, someone whose voice they may have even recognized. This strongly points back to a local, someone known to the family, or at least familiar. Payoff Seed 3. The psychology of the residency, the signature. This is the core. Why stay for 3 days? This is the killer's signature, the behavior that is not necessary to commit the crime, but is necessary to fulfill the killer's fantasy. To a profiler, this is the most terrifying trait. It signifies a complete and total lack of remorse. There is no post-crime panic, no adrenaline dump, no guilt. Instead, we see a comfort phase. The act of killing was the work. The act of staying was the reward. By slaying the family, especially the patriarch Andreas, the killer had conquered the farm. He had removed the obstacles. Now he could enjoy the spoils. Think of the psychology of this act. He walks past the bodies in the barn. He calmly forks hay to the cattle. He goes into the kitchen, slices bread. He builds a warm fire. He sleeps in a comfortable bed. This is not a human being in our sense of the word. This is an individual with a profound, cold-blooded psychopathy. He is at home with death because it is a tool for him to get what he wants. What did he want? He wanted the farm. He wanted to be the patriarch. This profile suggests a pseudo-commando or annihilator archetype, a killer who believes he is retaking what is rightfully his. When we combine all three seeds, the psychological profile becomes sharp. We are looking for a male, local, and known to the family. He is organized, patient, and manipulative. He has a profound sense of entitlement and a deep-seated personal rage against the Gruber family, particularly Andreas. He is comfortable with farm life, tending animals. And he is a cold, detached psychopath, capable of living for days alongside the evidence of his act. This profile, of course, points directly and unavoidably back to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man with the motive, the knowledge, and the suspicious behavior at the scene. But the haunting doesn't fit him. Why would he stalk a farm he knew so well? And so, the psychological autopsy leaves us with one final, haunting possibility. What if the killer wasn't local? What if he was a phantom in the truest sense? A vagrant, a deserter, a man from the woods who simply wanted a home and took this one. The aftermath of the Hinterkaifeck case left a permanent scar on the community. The farm itself was seen as a place of profound evil, a monument to a mystery that was too dark to comprehend. The year after the slayings, in 1923, the entire farmstead was demolished. The barn, the house, the stable, all were torn down to the foundation, as if the village could erase the act by erasing the architecture. Today, all that remains is a small shrine, a cross in a clearing of trees, marking the spot where 6 lives were ended. The case of Hinterkaifeck is a terrifying reflection on the limits of our understanding. It is a whodunit, where the who is less important than the what. It shows us that the most terrifying predator is not the one who attacks in a frenzy, but the one who watches, the one who learns you, the one who lives in your attic, walks in your footprints, and waits for the perfect moment to take what you have. The haunting echo of this case is not the sound of the pickaxe. It is the sound that came before it. It is the sound of the footsteps in the attic. It is the sound of the snow crunching under a stranger's boots. It is the chilling, psychological realization that the barrier between your safe, warm home and the cold, dark woods is not as strong as you think. In the history of criminal investigation, there is a specific type of case that leaves a scar, not just on the families of the victims, but on the entire psyche of a city. These are the cases where the assailant is not just a person, but a phantom, a faceless void that seems to represent all of the community's deepest fears. The year is 1971. Washington, D.C. is a city on the edge. It had recently become the first major American city with a majority black population, a center of culture, activism, and newfound political power. But it was also a city struggling with the deep wounds of the 1968 riots, economic disparity, and a rising tide of street crime. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of volatility. But for the thousands of families living in the northeast and southeast quadrants of the city, life went on. Children walked to school, teenagers met friends, and families gathered for dinner. Our story begins in this normal world on April 25, 1971. Carol Denise Spinks was 13 years old. She was a bright, happy girl known for her smile. She was in the 8th grade at Brown Junior High. That Sunday afternoon, she was sent on a simple, everyday errand. Her older sister had asked her to walk to a 7-Eleven just a few blocks from their home in the southeast D.C. neighborhood of Anacostia to buy a can of tomato paste and a TV guide. It was a walk she had made countless times. The 7-Eleven was on Good Hope Road, a busy thoroughfare. It was daylight. She was expected back in minutes. But Carol never came home. As the afternoon light faded into evening, her family began to worry. This was not like her. They called her friends. They called the police. A frantic, neighborhood-wide search began, radiating outward from the 7-Eleven. For 6 agonizing days, there was nothing, no trace. It was as if Carol Spinks had simply vanished from the face of the earth. This is the fracture, the moment the timeline of a normal Sunday afternoon breaks and a new, terrifying timeline begins. The city, already on edge, held its breath. The B-plot of our story, the fear of the community, began to weave itself into the A-plot of the investigation. In the black neighborhoods of D.C., a dark rumor began to circulate. Someone was taking their children. Then, 6 days later, on May 1st, 1971, the search came to a devastating end. A group of motorists, driving along the northbound lanes of the I-295, the Anacostia Freeway, saw something on the grassy embankment just off the shoulder of the road. It was the body of a young girl. Police quickly identified the remains. It was Carol Spinks. The scene was chillingly clinical. She was found lying just 15 feet from the highway, partially covered by a piece of discarded carpet. The autopsy would later reveal the cause of death was strangulation. Forensic evidence also indicated she had been held captive for several days before her life was taken. The community's worst fears were realized. This was not a runaway. This was not an accident. This was the act of a predator. The placement of her remains was the first terrifying signature. The assailant had not hidden her. He had displayed her alongside one of the city's busiest commuter routes, a place where she would be found quickly. It was an act of profound arrogance, a statement. The Washington, D.C. police were now facing a homicide investigation, but they had no leads, no suspects, and no motive. They didn't know it yet, but this was not an isolated act of violence. It was the beginning of a reign of terror. The discovery of Carol Spinks sent a shockwave of fear through the city's black neighborhoods. Parents who had once let their children walk to the store or to school were now holding them close. There was a phantom in their midst. The police, however, were struggling. They had no witnesses to the abduction, and the forensic evidence from the recovery scene was limited. The case was immediately a brick wall. For 2.5 months, the city simmered in this uneasy quiet. The investigation grew cold. The community tried to return to normal, hoping the horror was a singular, isolated event. Then, on July 19, 1971, the phantom returned. Darlania Denise Johnson was 16 years old. She lived in the same southeast D.C. neighborhood as Carol Spinks. That evening, around 6:30 p.m., she was sent on an errand to a local Safeway grocery store. Just like Carol, it was a simple, everyday task. And just like Carol, she never returned. Her family reported her missing immediately. The parallels to the Spinks case were terrifying and undeniable. The police, now fearing a pattern, launched a massive search. This time, they did not have to wait 6 days. 11 days later, on July 30th, the remains of Darlania Johnson were found. The location was once again the chilling signature of the assailant. She was found on the grassy median of the I-295 freeway, the exact same highway where Carol Spinks had been discovered. She was just 100 feet from the spot. The cause of death was the same, strangulation. The city's fear turned to panic. This was not a coincidence. This was a series. The Washington, D.C. Police, led by a homicide unit that was already overworked and under-equipped, were now officially hunting a serial assailant. The media, picking up on the highway connection, gave him a name: the Freeway Phantom. The Phantom, however, was just beginning. He was escalating, and his next act would provide the single most baffling psychological clue of the entire investigation. On July 27, 1971, before Darlenia Johnson's body had even been found, the Phantom abducted his third victim. Brenda Faye Crockett was 10 years old. She lived in Northwest D.C., a different quadrant of the city, but still within the same vulnerable community. She was sent to a local store by her mother to buy a loaf of bread. It was 4 p.m. She was given $1. She skipped out the door. She never came back. Her mother, frantic, reported her missing. But what happened next is what elevates this case from a simple tragedy to a complex psychological puzzle. This is psychological seed number 1. At approximately 7:15 p.m., about 3 hours after she was last seen, the phone rang at Brenda Crockett's home. Her 13-year-old sister, Sandra, answered. It was Brenda, but she was not alone. The 10-year-old girl spoke in a strange, flat, robotic monotone. She told her sister she was on her way home. The call ended. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Brenda's mother, Pearl, answered. Again, it was Brenda, her voice still unnervingly calm. She said she was at a white lady's house and that she was coming home. Then, a short time later, a third call. This time, Brenda's 14-year-old brother, Michael, answered. The call was longer. Brenda said, "A white man took me." She said he was in a green car. She said he hit her and she was bleeding. And then, the most chilling detail. Michael heard Brenda ask a question, not to him, but to someone in the room with her. She said, "Can I go home now?" A deep, male voice was heard in the background. The voice said something indistinct. Brenda got back on the phone and told her brother, "I'll be home." The line went dead. This was the last time Brenda Crockett's family ever heard from her. We must pause here, as the family and the police were forced to. What is the psychology of this act? Why would an abductor allow his victim to call home, not once, but 3 times? Was this a form of psychological torture? A way for the assailant to insert himself into the family's terror? Was he getting a thrill from listening to the panic? Or was this a game? Was he trying to manipulate the family and the police, feeding them misdirection, a white man, a green car, to send them down the wrong path? Or, most tragically, was this 10-year-old Brenda's own desperate, courageous attempt to send a message? Was she trying to feed her family clues right under the nose of her captor? The family, terrified and confused, relayed the calls to the police. An all-night search commenced, but the calls could not be traced. The next day, July 28th, at 1:40 p.m., Brenda's body was found. The location, again, was the signature. She was found in a conspicuous, visible spot, lying face down in the grass near a service road off Route 50 near the I-295 interchange. The Phantom was staying true to his name. The autopsy revealed the same method, strangulation. Forensic evidence also showed she had been violated. The city was now in the grip of mass hysteria. A killer was taking their children, holding them, taunting their families, and then discarding them along the city's freeways. The Phantom's pace was accelerating. He was becoming more brazen. He waited less than 2 months. On September 5, 1971, 12-year-old Nenamashia Yates was walking home from a Safeway store in Northeast D.C. She, too, vanished. 3 days later, on September 8th, her remains were found. The The location was different, but the intent was the same. She was discovered in a wooded area near the intersection of two major roads, the Suitland Parkway and the I-295. The method was identical: strangulation. 4 victims, all young black girls, all abducted from busy public areas while running errands, all found discarded near a major DC freeway. The police were desperate. They formed a massive 60-man task force dubbed the Green Vega Task Force, based on the lead from the Brenda Crockett phone call. They stopped every green-colored Chevrolet Vega in the DC area, a massive, time-consuming effort that ultimately led nowhere. The assailant seemed to be one step ahead, a ghost who could abduct children in broad daylight and leave no trace. And then he provided his second and most explicit psychological signature. On October 15, 1971, 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard vanished. She was a student at Federal City College, and she was last seen getting off a bus, walking home. On November 6th, her remains were found in a wooded area, again near the I-295 interchange. The cause of death was strangulation. But this time, the assailant had left something. Tucked inside the pocket of Brenda Woodard's jacket, police found a small, neatly folded note. It was not a ransom note. It was not a confession. It was a psychological manifesto. This is psychological seed number 2. The note was written in pencil on a piece of paper torn from Brenda Woodard's own school notebook. The handwriting was neat, almost practiced, and it was written in the first person. It was written by Brenda Woodard, but it was dictated by her captor. It read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. Freeway Phantom." This note electrified the investigation. It was the first direct communication from the assailant, and it was psychologically devastating. We must analyze this. This is the clinical weave. The word tantamount, this is not common vocabulary. This suggests an individual with some level of education, someone who is, at the very least, trying to sound intelligent. My insensitivity to people, especially women. He is forcing his victim to write his own psychological profile. He is acknowledging his lack of empathy. He is not just a brute. He is self-aware. He understands what he is, and he is proud of it. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. This is pure narcissistic taunting. He is dangling the other murders in front of the police. He is daring them. He is reveling in his own perceived superiority. And finally, he gives himself the name the media has been using, Freeway Phantom. He is embracing his dark celebrity. But the most chilling aspect is the act itself. He sat with his victim, 18-year-old Brenda Woodard, in the final hours of her life. And in that time, he did not just commit a physical act. He forced her to participate in a psychological ritual. He forced her to become the scribe of her own killer's manifesto. It is an act of profound, calculated mental cruelty. The city was now facing a predator who was not just violent, but intelligent, arrogant, and self-aware. He claimed one final victim. On November 18, 1971, just 12 days after Woodard's note was found, 17-year-old Diane Williams vanished from her neighborhood in southeast D.C. Her remains were found the next day, November 19th. She was found in the same horrifying, familiar dumping ground, alongside the I-295. The method was the same: strangulation. 6 victims, 6 young black women. Their lives ended, their bodies discarded. And then, as suddenly as he had begun, the phantom vanished. The slaying stopped. The abductions ended. The Freeway Phantom disappeared back into the void from which he had come, leaving a city scarred. a community terrified, and a police force with only two baffling psychological clues. The discovery of Diane Williams, the sixth victim, marked the end of the Freeway Phantom's active period. But it was the beginning of the most intense and ultimately most frustrating manhunt in Washington, D.C.'s history. The city was in a state of controlled panic. The B-plot, the community's terror, was now the dominant narrative. Parents refused to let their children play outside. They organized neighborhood watches, escorted children to and from school in groups. A 10 p.m. curfew was imposed on all teenagers. The police were under immense, suffocating pressure. The Homicide Division, led by Captain Carl Register, poured every available resource into the Green Vega task force. They were facing a public that was not just scared, but angry. The community felt that the investigation was failing them, that if the victims had been white, the response would have been different. The police, meanwhile, felt they were chasing a ghost. The investigation focused on two main pathways: the Green Vega lead and the psychological profile. The Green Vega lead, which had come from the 10-year-old Brenda Crockett's phone call, became an obsession. Police stopped hundreds, if not thousands, of green-colored cars. They interviewed their owners, checked their alibis. It was a massive, brute force effort. It led absolutely nowhere. They also had a few tantalizing but ultimately fruitless eyewitness reports. Several people claimed to have seen a young black girl, fitting the description of one of the victims, in a car with a black man. Some described a green car. Others described a brown or blue car. The descriptions of the man were vague and contradictory. The investigation was drowning in noise. The Phantom had operated with terrifying precision. He abducted his victims in broad daylight, from public streets, and yet not a single credible witness to the abductions themselves was ever found. This suggests a specific, chilling predator, not a blitz attacker who grabbed someone in a dark alley, but a con man, someone who could charm, persuade, or manipulate a child into getting into his car willingly. He was, as his note suggested, an individual who understood psychology and used it as his primary weapon. The police were left with only one viable path: the suspects. The hunt stalled. The weeks turned into months. The months turned into a year. The Freeway Phantom did not strike again. The task force was eventually, quietly, downsized. But the case was never closed. Over the years, the investigation circled around a handful of persons of interest. This is the unmasking phase of a whodunit, but in this case, the mask never truly came off. Several men were looked at, but the focus, both then and now, has always been on one primary group: a loose-knit gang of 4 men, all of whom were known to local police for petty crimes, and all of whom, crucially, lived and operated in the same neighborhoods where the victims were taken. These men were known to drive together, sometimes in a green car. This theory suggests that the Freeway Phantom was not one man, but a group. This would explain the ability to control the victims, and perhaps explains the different, contradictory witness reports. But a compelling group theory requires a ringleader, a central intelligence. And this brings us to the bridge, the moment of near resolution. In 1974, 2 years after the slaying stopped, the DC police publicly named a prime suspect. His name was Edward L. Selman. Selman was a local man who fit many aspects of a potential profile. He was known in the community. He had a history of violence. He was, at the time, already incarcerated for unrelated assault charges. The police announced they were close to an indictment. The city held its breath, believing the who was finally about to be solved. And then, the brick wall. The case against Selman, which was largely circumstantial, fell apart. The evidence was simply not strong enough. He was never charged. The other members of his group were also investigated. One, Robert Askins, was later convicted of an unrelated murder. Another, Warren Morris, died. The fourth, Joseph J. Brown, was investigated but also never charged in connection with the Phantom case. This is the great, frustrating climax of the hunt. The police felt, and many investigators still feel, that they had their men. They believed the Phantom was likely one or more of these four individuals, but they could never prove it. The tension of the hunt was over. The physical threat was gone. The what and who were almost solved, but remained just out of reach, shrouded in legal ambiguity and a lack of forensic evidence. The city was left with no capture, no confession, no trial. The only thing left to do was to look back at the clues he left behind, not for a name, but for a reason. The case moved from the homicide department to the psychological profilers. The who was a failure. The only thing left to solve was the why. The case went cold. The files gathered dust. But the trial never truly answered the central question: why? The Freeway Phantom was gone, but his psychological signature remained, embedded in two key pieces of evidence: the phone calls to Brenda Crockett's family and the dictated note found on Brenda Woodard. To understand the why, we must put on the FBI agent persona. We must become a profiler and analyze these clues as a suspenseful investigation into the mind of the assailant. This is not a lecture. This is a battle of wits with a ghost. Payoff seed number 1, the psychology of the phone call, the game. Let's return to the night of July 27, 1971. 10-year-old Brenda Crockett is on the phone with her family. From a profiler's perspective, this is the act of a power-assertive assailant. The thrill is not just in the physical act, it is in the control. Why would he allow the calls? We can dismiss the idea that he was careless. This man was meticulous. He abducted 6 victims without a single credible witness. This was not a mistake. It was intentional. He was staging the event. Let's analyze the manipulation. He has Brenda, a 10-year-old child. He has her call home. He listens. This is a form of psychological vampirism. He is feeding on the family's terror. He is inserting himself into their home, into their most intimate moments of panic. He is no longer just an unknown abductor. He is now a voice in the background, a character in their family drama. This elevates his sense of power. Now, let's look at the Green Vega lead. Brenda says, "A white man took me." This is the most critical piece of misdirection. The victims were all black. The neighborhoods were all black. The eyewitness reports, however vague, all pointed to a black man. The prime suspects were all black. The white man detail was almost certainly a lie, dictated by the assailant. This is an act of a cold, organized individual. He is already thinking about the investigation. He is actively planting false evidence to send the police force, a majority white institution in 1971, on a racially motivated wild goose chase. He is using the city's own racial tensions as a weapon to cover his tracks. And what about Brenda's question? Can I go home now? This is the most heartbreaking part. From a profiler's view, this suggests the assailant was using a con. He likely did not kidnap her in the violent sense. He lured her. He may have told her he was a policeman or a social worker. He may have told her she was in trouble and he was helping her. The phone calls were part of the con. Call your family. Tell them you're okay. We're just sorting this out and then you can go home. She was, up until the very end, likely a compliant victim, manipulated by a predator who disguised himself as an authority figure or a friend. The calls were not a cry for help. They were a performance, staged by the assailant for his own psychological gratification and for the tactical purpose of misdirection. Payoff seed number 2, the psychology of the note, the manifesto. Now, let's analyze the note found on Brenda Woodard. This is the dossier, the making of this mind. This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. This single sentence is a psychological goldmine. First, the word tantamount. This is not just an intelligent word, it is a formal word. It's the language of a courtroom, a legal document, or a college paper. This suggests the assailant either has this level of education, or, more likely, he aspires to it. He is a pseudo-intellectual. He wants to be seen as smart, sophisticated, and complex. This is a classic trait of an organized narcissist. He is proud of his insensitivity. He sees it not as a flaw, but as a strength. It is what makes him superior to us, to people, especially women. He is not an explosive assailant who loses control. He is a cold, cognitive assailant. He has thought about his insensitivity. He has analyzed it. He has named it. And he is forcing his victim to write it down. This is the signature. This is the ritual. Why? From a profiler's perspective, this is the ultimate act of dehumanization. It's a confession. He is forcing her to document his crime. He is making her an accessory to her own demise. It's a transferal. In his mind, she is the one who is insensitive. He is likely a man who feels wronged by women. He feels victimized by society. In this twisted psychological ritual, he is forcing her to admit to the sins he believes women have committed against him. It's a trophy. This note is a trophy, just like the Freeway Phantom name. He knew it would be found. He wanted it to be found. He wanted the police, the media, and the world to read his words and marvel at his cold, intellectual superiority. When we combine these two seeds, a clear profile emerges. We are looking for a black male, likely in his 20s or 30s at the time. He is local to the DC area with intimate knowledge of the freeway system and the neighborhoods. He is an organized predator. He has a reliable vehicle, possibly a green one, but not necessarily. He uses a con to lure his victims. Psychologically, he is a power-assertive narcissist. He is intelligent, or at least believes he is, pseudo-intellectual. He feels wronged by the world, particularly by women. His primary motive is not violence, it is control and domination. He craves the power to manipulate, to stage these events, to taunt the police, and to feed on the terror he creates. This profile, of course, fits the prime suspect, Edward Selman, and his associates, almost perfectly. But the profile, as precise as it is not a confession. It is not an indictment. It is simply a haunting, detailed portrait of a ghost. The Freeway Phantom case was never officially solved. The 6 slayings that terrified Washington, D.C. from 1971 to 1972 remain officially open. The human cost of this void is immeasurable. 6 families, the Spinks, the Johnsons, the Crockett's, the Yates, the Woodards, and the Williams, were left without justice. They were left with only the what and never the who or the why. The B-plot of our story, the community, was also left with a permanent scar. For a generation of people in D.C., the Freeway Phantom became a dark bogeyman, a symbol of a time when the system failed to protect them, and their children were stolen from their own streets. In 2009, the case was formally reopened, a cold case investigation, hoping that new technology, particularly DNA, could finally provide an answer. But the forensic evidence from the 1970s was poorly preserved. To date, no definitive DNA match has been made. The case of the Freeway Phantom is a profound reflection on the nature of a serial crime. It is not just a series of acts, it is a narrative written by the assailant. This assailant wrote his story using the freeways of DC as his canvas and the media as his publisher. He was an author, and his book was about his own insensitivity, his own power, his own superiority. The final, haunting echo of this case is the note itself. It is the voice of the phantom, captured on paper, dictated to a victim in her final moments. It is a voice that is arrogant, intelligent, and absolutely, chillingly devoid of humanity. It is the voice of a man who turned a city into his own personal psychological theater, and then, when he was finished, simply took his bow and exited the stage, leaving us in the dark. Some crimes are mysteries because the assailant is a phantom, a stranger who strikes from the shadows and vanishes. But other crimes are, perhaps, more chilling. They are the mysteries where the assailant is known, where they are a neighbor, a friend, a familiar face. It is a story of extreme personal violence and a set of psychological contradictions that have haunted investigators for over 40 years. The year is 1981. We are in Keddie, California, a tiny, struggling resort community nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Keddie was once a bustling stop for the railroad, but by 1981, its best days were long gone. It was a place of transient families, seasonal workers, and people trying to find a fresh start, living in rustic, somewhat run-down rental cabins. It was the perfect place for 36-year-old Glenna Sue to begin again. Sue had recently left an abusive relationship in Connecticut and moved across the country with her 5 children. She was a devoted mother, described as kind and resilient, doing her best to build a safe haven for her family. In the fall of 1980, she and her 5 children, 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg, moved into Cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort. It was a small, 2-bedroomed cabin, but it was theirs. The children settled in, made friends, and life, for a time, found a normal rhythm. But the community was not entirely peaceful. The resort, with its thin walls and transient population, was rife with petty crime, drug use, and a simmering undercurrent of local tension. Sue Sharp had reportedly become a counselor and friend to another local woman who was in an abusive marriage, offering her support. This act of kindness, police believe, may have inadvertently angered the woman's husband, a neighbor named Martin Smart. This tension is the backdrop for the night of April 11th, 1981. This is the last normal day. It's a Saturday. The 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, have a friend over to spend the night. The friend is 12-year-old Justin Smart, the stepson of the very neighbor Sue was allegedly in conflict with. That evening, the oldest daughter, 14-year-old Sheila, decides to spend the night at a neighbor's cabin, just a few doors down. This leaves 5 people inside Cabin 28. Sue Sharp, 36 years old, her son, John, 15, her daughter, Tina, 12, and, in the boys' bedroom, Rick, 10, Greg, 5, and their friend Justin, 12. Later that evening, John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate arrives at the cabin. The teenagers are last seen together listening to music, just being kids. The lights in Cabin 28 go out. The mountain air is cold and still. This is the moment the timeline fractures. The next morning, Sunday, April 12th, at approximately 7 a.m., 14-year-old Sheila Sharp leaves her friend's cabin and walks the few yards back home. She opens the door to Cabin 28. And the safe haven her mother had tried to build is gone. The scene she walks into is one of almost unimaginable, targeted violence. This is the forensic beat. The living room is covered in blood. Lying on the floor, she finds 3 bodies. They are her mother, Sue,
her brother, John, and John's friend, Dana Wingate. They are bound, gagged, and lifeless.
The autopsies would later paint a portrait of pure, personal rage. This was not a clean, professional act. This was a blitz attack, an explosion of frenzied, intimate violence. Sue Sharp was found lying on the living room floor, her hands and feet bound with electrical tape and appliance wire. She had been slain with a combination of a knife and a claw hammer. John Sharp and Dana Wingate had also been bound. They had been slain with the same hammer and, in Dana's case, strangled. The scene was so brutal, so extreme, that a bent steak knife was found at the scene, its blade snapped in half from the force of the attack. This is psychological seed number 2, the overkill. The level of violence, the use of multiple weapons, hammers, knives, the bindings, the sheer brutality, was far beyond what was necessary to commit the act. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a quiet slang. This was an annihilation. It spoke of a deep, personal, and explosive rage. Sheila, in a state of shock, turns from this scene of horror, and she sees something that makes no sense. She looks toward the boys' bedroom, and she sees her 2 younger brothers, Rick and Greg, and their friend Justin Smart. This is psychological seed number 1, the survivors. The 3 boys are alive. They are in their beds. They are physically, completely unharmed. They are just quiet, terrified, in a state of shock. We must pause and absorb this contradiction. In the next room, a brutal, loud, chaotic struggle has taken place. A struggle involving multiple assailants, multiple victims, and extreme violence, lasting long enough to bind and slay 3 separate people. And yet, just feet away, separated only by a thin wooden door, 3 young children were left untouched. How? Why? Sheila grabs the 3 boys and flees the cabin, screaming, running to the neighbors for help. The police are called. The small community of Keddie is thrown into chaos. And as the Plumas County Sheriff's deputies begin to process the scene, they discover the 3rd, and perhaps most baffling psychological seed. Someone is missing. 12-year-old Tina Sharp is not in the living room with her mother and brother. She is not in the bedroom with her younger brothers. Her bedding is found in the living room, suggesting she had been on the couch, but she is gone. This is psychological seed number 3, the abduction. The scene now presents 3 contradictory psychological questions that form the brick wall of this case. Why the overkill? What kind of rage fuels such a personal, brutal attack? Why the survivors? Why spare the 3 boys when they were potential witnesses? Why the abduction? Why slay 3 people at the scene, but take the time and effort to remove a 4th? The assailants had not just committed a triple slaying. They had, in the midst of this chaos, selectively and quietly abducted a 12-year-old girl and vanished into the morning light. The hunt for Tina Sharp and for the assailants began immediately, but the investigation was, by all accounts, a catastrophic failure from the first hour. The scene at Cabin 28 was small, contained, and should have been a forensic gold mine. Instead, it was treated with what has been described as shocking incompetence. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was small, rural, and completely unequipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. Dozens of people, neighbors, onlookers, and unauthorized personnel were allowed to tramp through the cabin, contaminating the scene. Fingerprints were wiped from surfaces. Evidence was moved. The chain of custody was broken. One deputy allegedly palmed the bent steak knife, the potential murder weapon, and carried it out, destroying any print evidence. The investigation was a brick wall, not because of the assailant's skill, but because of the investigators' failures. The B-plot, the survivors, was also mishandled. The 3 young boys, Rick,
Greg and Justin were the only witnesses. They were interviewed, but their accounts were confused, contradictory, and clouded by trauma. 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg claimed they had slept through the entire thing. But the 12-year-old friend, Justin Smart, told police a different story. He claimed he had seen something. He said he saw Sue Sharp lying on the floor with 2 men. He described them. He even claimed he had a dream about the slayings. But his story was dismissed by the lead investigator as the imaginings of a traumatized child. The police failed to see the most critical connection, that this witness was the stepson of their prime suspect. The hunt for who quickly focused on 2 men. Suspect 1, Marty Smart. Marty Smart was the neighbor from cabin 26. He was Justin's stepfather. And he was the man who, as we noted, was allegedly furious with Sue Sharp for interfering in his marriage. His behavior on the day of the discovery was highly suspicious. He was one of the first neighbors on the scene. He inserted himself into the investigation, offering help. And, crucially, he vanished from Keddy just a short time after the slayings. Suspect 2, John Beau Boubet. Boubade was not a local. He was a house guest, staying with Marty Smart in cabin 26. Boubade was a phantom of a different kind. He had a long, violent criminal history, including armed robbery, and had connections to organized crime in Chicago. He was, in short, a man capable of extreme violence. He, too, vanished from Keddy with Smart. The investigation now had 2 prime suspects, both of whom had a motive, Smart's rage, and the means, Boubade's violent past, and who had fled the state. But the police failed to act. They did not pursue them. And this is where the hunt stalls, until it is broken open years later by a single, stunning bridge clue. A full investigation by a new sheriff's department in the 2000s uncovered a letter written by Martin Smart that was, for all intents and purposes, a confession. The letter was written in 1981, just weeks after the slayings, from Smart to his wife, Marilyn. In it, he wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." This was the smoking gun. But there was more. The investigation also uncovered reports from a Veterans Affairs hospital therapist in Reno, Nevada. Martin Smart had, allegedly, gone to this therapist and confessed outright. He told the therapist that he had killed Sue Sharp because she was trying to break up his marriage. He said that his friend, Beau, had slain John Sharp and Dana Wingate. And he solved the mystery of the missing girl. He allegedly told the therapist that while the slayings were in progress, 12-year-old Tina Sharp had walked in from the bedroom. She saw the whole thing. This is the unmasking. The who was not a random stranger. It was the neighbor from cabin 26. The tension of the hunt, the whodunit, is seemingly resolved. We have the who, Smart and Boubade. We have the what, a triple slaying and an abduction. But the confession was never acted upon. Martin Smart died in 2000. Beau Boubade died in 1988. They were never charged. They were never brought to justice. And their confession, while solving the who, only deepens the why. It forces us to look back at the scene not as a mystery, but as a psychological puzzle. The confession was in, the names were known, but the case remained a void. The official motive, Smart's rage at Sue Sharp, feels thin. It doesn't explain the contradictions. It doesn't explain the behavior. To understand, we must conduct a psychological autopsy. We must apply the profiler lens to the 3 seeds that make this case so baffling. Payoff Seed 2, the psychology of the overkill, the rage. Let's begin with the violence itself. The bindings, the hammers, the knives. From a profiler's perspective, this is overkill, and overkill always equals personal rage. This was not a robbery. This was not a dispassionate hit. This was a blitz attack, fueled by a narcissistic wound. Martin Smart's confession that he killed Sue makes perfect psychological sense. Sue had wronged him. She had threatened his control over his wife. The attack on her was the primary goal. It was a punishment and annihilation. But what about John and Dana? Smart's confession claims Bubade slew them.
This also makes psychological sense. They were not the targets, they were complications. They were teenage boys, 15 and 17, who would have fought back. The violence against them was tactical. The violence against Sue was personal. This was not a single chaotic event. It was two different types of violence happening at once. Smart's personal rage and Bubade's tactical elimination of witnesses. Payoff Seed 3. The psychology of the abduction. The witness. This brings us to Tina. Why take her? The assailants had just committed a loud, brutal triple slaying. The last thing a logical killer would do is take on a new problem, a 12-year-old girl. Unless she was the one problem they couldn't solve at the scene. Smart's confession is the key. She saw the whole thing. This was not a planned abduction. This was a panic. In the midst of the chaos, 12-year-old Tina Sharp likely walked out of her room, awakened by the sounds. She saw Martin Smart, her neighbor, her stepbrother's father, slaying her mother. She was the one witness who could, without a doubt, identify him. They couldn't slay her there. Why? Perhaps because of the other boys in the room. Perhaps because, in their panicked state, they couldn't risk the noise. So they did the only other thing they could. They silenced her by removing her. The abduction was a panicked, tactical decision to destroy the one piece of evidence that could link them, undeniably, to the crime. Payoff Seed 1. The psychology of the survivors. The baffling mercy. This is the core of the psychological puzzle. Why spare Rick, 10, Greg, 5, and Justin, 12? They were in the next room. The theory that they slept through it is frankly almost impossible given the level of violence. This was not mercy. This was a choice. From a profiler's perspective, the assailants knew those boys were in that room, and they chose to leave them. Why? The answer is Justin Smart. One of the three survivors was the stepson of the primary assailant. This was not a stranger attack. This was, psychologically, a domestic dispute that spiraled into a mass slaying. Martin Smart, for all his rage, was still a father. His target was Sue. His stepson, Justin, was not part of that rage. To harm Justin or his friends would be to cross a different, darker psychological line, a line that even Smart and his violent associate, Bubade, were not willing to cross. They were annihilators, but they were not, in that moment, child killers. The presence of Justin Smart in that room acted as a psychological shield for the other two boys. The assailants compartmentalized their rage. The living room was the kill zone. The bedroom, containing one of their own, was safe. This also explains why Justin's testimony was so confusing. He did see the men. He did see his stepfather. But he was a 12-year-old boy, terrified, and in an impossible situation. He was later, allegedly, told by Smart to forget what he saw. His dream was likely a repressed, traumatic memory. The entire baffling crime scene is not a contradiction. It is a perfect, terrifying portrait of a domestic annihilator, a man who is capable of extreme, targeted violence, but who still operates within his own twisted, familial code. The psychological profile is clear. The confessions are known, but the justice never came. For 3 agonizing years, the B-plot, the surviving Sharp children, were left in a void.
Sheila, Rick, and Greg were not only grieving their family, but they were haunted by the unknown of what happened to their sister, Tina. Then in 1984, 3 years after the slangs, an anonymous caller gave the police a grim location. At Camp 18, a remote, wooded area nearly 30 miles from Keddie, investigators found the partial skull and jawbone of a young person. Dental records confirmed it. It was Tina Sharp. The abduction was solved. She had been taken from the cabin only to be slain, her remains discarded in the wilderness, silencing her forever. The case of Cabin 28 is a reflection on how justice can be contaminated, just like a crime scene. The investigation failed, not because the assailants were phantoms, but because they were neighbors. The case was bungled from the start, allowing Smart and Bubaid to die as free men, taking their final official confession with them. But the case is not cold. The haunting echo of Keddie is that the hunt continues. In 2016, a new sheriff, Greg Hagwood, officially reopened the case. He and the surviving Sharp family members have been relentless. They re-interviewed witnesses, they tracked down new leads, and in a local pond, they recovered a hammer, which they believe is one of the original weapons kept as a trophy by Smart. Forensic science has finally caught up. In 2018, the Sheriff's Department announced that DNA evidence had been recovered from the original scene, a piece of tape. And that DNA, they announced, was a match to a living suspect, an alleged accomplice of Smart and Bubaid. The case of Cabin 28 is a terrifying reminder that the most brutal violence often comes from the most familiar places. It is a story of a safe haven shattered, not by a monster from the woods, but by the rage next door. Most of the cases we cover are defined by what is found at the scene, the forensic evidence, the physical clues, the brutal, tangible facts of the act. But tonight, we are covering a case that is defined by what isn't there. It is a case about a void. It is a mystery built from a series of small, baffling, and deeply chilling psychological clues that, when combined, create a portrait of a predator who was not just a brute, but a ghost. This is the story of Lauren Ron, a 14-year-old girl who vanished from her own home. It is a case that begins with a simple, terrifying question. Why were all the light bulbs unscrewed? The year is 1980. We are in Manchester, New Hampshire, a working-class city defined by its historic brick mill buildings and the Merrimack River that cuts through it. Our normal world centers on a third-floor apartment in a building on Merrimack Street. This is the home of 32-year-old Judith Ron and her 14-year-old daughter, Laureen. Laureen Ran was a typical teenager of the era. She was a freshman in high school. She loved roller skating, listening to music, and hanging out with her friends. She was, by all accounts, a good kid, but one who was just starting to test the boundaries of her independence. She had recently, briefly, run away from home for a day after an argument with her mother, a fact that would later tragically complicate the investigation. But that was in the past. By April of 1980, their life had settled back into a normal routine. Judith was a single mother working hard to provide for her daughter. Our timeline begins on the night of Friday, April 25, 1980. It is the last normal day, or at least the last normal evening. Laureen has 2 friends over to the apartment, a male friend and her 14-year-old girlfriend, Sherry Ann DeMore. The teenagers are doing what teenagers do, listening to music, talking. Later, Laureen and Sherry allegedly experiment with some alcohol. Around 7:30 p.m., Judith Ron gets ready to leave. She works the night shift. She says goodnight to her daughter and her friends and heads to work, expecting to be home in the morning. The male friend leaves the apartment around 10 p.m. This leaves Laureen and Sherry alone in the third-floor apartment. At some point, the girls get ready for bed. Laureen takes the pull-out sofa bed in the living room. Sherry takes Laureen's bed in the bedroom. They fall asleep. The television is left on, its blue light flickering in the living room. The night passes.
At approximately 1:30 a.m. on Saturday, April 26th, Judith Ron returns home early from her shift. She walks up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. She puts her key in the lock, opens the door, and steps inside. The television is on, casting a dim glow. She sees Lorraine's friend, Sherry, asleep in her daughter's bedroom. She is safe and undisturbed. She looks at the sofa bed in the living room. The blankets are there, but Lorraine is not. Judith assumes, with a sigh of frustration, that Lorraine has simply gone out, perhaps to a friend's house, despite the late hour. She is annoyed, but not yet alarmed. She decides to wait up for her. She walks to the back of the apartment, to the kitchen, and there she finds the first sign that this is not a simple case of a teenager breaking curfew. The back door of the apartment, a door that led to a rear staircase, is standing wide open. This is the fracture. The moment a normal, domestic scene shatters into a million terrifying questions. Why is the back door open? Judith's annoyance instantly turns to a cold, sharp dread. She frantically checks the apartment. Lorraine's shoes are still there. Her purse is there. Her money is there. A person who goes out takes their shoes and their money. A person who is taken leaves them behind. Judith runs to the bedroom and shakes Sherry awake. Where is Lorraine? Sherry is disoriented. She is groggy, perhaps from the alcohol, perhaps from a deep sleep. She says she doesn't know. She says she didn't hear anything, she didn't see anything. Judith calls the police. The normal world of the Rand family is over. Lorraine Rand has vanished from a locked apartment, from a room where a friend was sleeping, leaving only an open back door and a terrifying, profound silence. The police arrive at the 3rd-floor apartment on Merrimack Street. The initial scene is one of baffling contradictions. This is the forensic beat. And what is chilling is not the presence of violence, but the complete lack of it, combined with a series of small, staged details that suggest a predator's careful planning. The investigators process the apartment and find nothing. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry on the front door. The back door was found open, but its lock was not broken. The scene is psychologically confounding. This brings us to psychological seed number 2, the sleeping witness. The most significant fact of the scene is Sherry Ann DeMoore, asleep in the bedroom. She insists she heard nothing. We must pause and analyze this. Lorraine was on the sofa in the living room. Sherry was in the bedroom, just down a small hall. For an assailant to enter the apartment, subdue a 14-year-old girl, and remove her from the living room without making enough noise to wake the other 14-year-old girl, it seems impossible. It implies one of 2 things. A silent abduction. The assailant was preternaturally quiet, a ghost. A compliant victim. Lorraine knew the person. She went with them willingly, perhaps whispering, "I'll be right back," and never returned. This compliant theory is what the police initially latch onto, especially given Lorraine's recent history of running away. It seems plausible. But then, Judith Ron, in her frantic search, discovers something outside the apartment. She notices that the hallway of the apartment building is dark, unnaturally dark. She looks up, and she finds the single most terrifying clue of the entire case. This is psychological seed number 1, the light bulbs. In the 3rd-floor common hallway, the only path to and from the back staircase, every single light bulb has been unscrewed, not smashed, not broken, loosened. Someone had, with foresight and patience, walked down the hall and methodically, quietly unscrewed each bulb, plunging the entire area into absolute, impenetrable darkness. This single fact shatters the runaway theory.
A 14-year-old girl sneaking out to meet a friend does not prep the scene by unscrewing all the lights. This is the act of a predator. This is a staging act. It is the signature of an organized, process-oriented assailant. Let's apply the profiler's lens. This act shows us surveillance. The assailant had been in the building before. He knew the layout. He knew where the lights were. Planning. This was not an impulse crime. He brought this tool, the darkness, with him. Psychological control. He was prepping the battlefield. He was creating an environment of confusion and terror for his victim, and, more importantly, a shield of concealment for himself. The open back door was not a sign of a runaway. It was the exit route. The what of this case is now clear. This was a planned abduction. An assailant, under the cover of a darkness he himself had created, entered the apartment, likely through the unlocked back door. He subdued Lorene Ron, perhaps with a threat, perhaps with a weapon. And this is where the mystery of the sleeping witness becomes even more chilling. Why leave Sherry? This is psychological seed number 2, revised. The assailant was in the apartment. He knew there were 2 girls. He took Lorene from the sofa and left Sherry in the bedroom. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was not a blitz attack on the first person he saw. This was a targeted abduction. The assailant came to that apartment on that night for Lorene. He knew she was there. He may have even known she was on the sofa. And he knew and did not care that her friend was in the next room. The scene is now a portrait of a stalker, someone who had been watching Lorene, someone who knew her routines, someone who knew the building. The investigation, armed with this terrifying new psychological profile, begins. But they are already days behind. The case is not a runaway. It is a whodunit. The hunt for Lorene Ron was now officially a hunt for an organized predator. But the investigation was hopelessly fractured. The Manchester Police Department, still half convinced this was a runaway case due to Lorene's prior history, was slow to act. Those first 48 hours, the most critical in any abduction, were lost. The B-plot, our emotional anchor, Lorene's mother, Judith Ron, was left to do her own investigation. She was the one who pushed the predator theory. She was the one who pointed, again and again, to the unscrewed light bulbs. She was the one who insisted her daughter would not leave without her shoes or her purse. The police, meanwhile, looked for the who. They interviewed the male friend who had left at 10 p.m. He was cleared. They interviewed Sherry Ann DeMore. Her story remained the same. She heard nothing, she saw nothing. They interviewed local persons of interest. They found no leads. The case was a brick wall. The trail was cold. Weeks turned into months. The family was left in a void of agonizing silence. And then the B-plot produced the next and most bizarre set of clues. This is psychological seed number 3, the phone calls. Judith Ron, in her grief, was left with the grim task of sorting through her daughter's life. Months after the abduction, she received her phone bill, and on it, she found a series of strange, long-distance calls, all made from her apartment phone after she had left for work on April 25th, but before Lorene was taken. These were not calls to local friends. The calls were to California. Judith, desperate, investigated. She learned the calls were made to 2 numbers: a motel in Santa Monica, California, a teen runaway hotline in California. This new evidence baffled police. It seemed to swing the pendulum back to the runaway theory. Was it possible Lorene was planning to run away? Did she call a hotline for help? Did she call a motel to see if a friend, or perhaps a groomer, had arrived? This new lead, however, also went nowhere. The police could not connect Lorene to any known individuals in California. The calls were a dead end, another baffling contradiction. And then The second set of phone calls began. These were the calls that came after the abduction. Weeks and months after Lorene vanished, the phone in Judith Ron's apartment would ring, always at the same horrifying hour, 3:45 a.m. Judith, desperate for any sign of her daughter, would answer. The line was always silent. No breathing, no voice, just an open, empty line. She would say, "Hello? Hello? Lorene?" And then a click. The line would go dead. This happened multiple times, always at 3:45 a.m., always silent. This was not a wrong number. This was psychological torture. The hunt for Lorene Ron had now transformed. It was no longer a physical search of the woods and streets of Manchester. It was a psychological battle of wits with an unknown assailant. The Who was now a profile of almost unimaginable cruelty, an organized predator who abducts a 14-year-old girl and then calls the mother for weeks in the dead of night just to listen to her panic. The case was completely stalled. Until, in 1985, 5 years after the abduction, a sex trafficking ring was busted in California. A woman who was rescued, a victim of that ring, told police a story. She claimed that a 14-year-old girl named Lorene had been held captive by the ring and that she had later been sold. This lead was electrifying. It connected the California calls to a tangible, horrifying outcome. But the unmasking never happened. The lead, like all the others, dissolved. The woman's story could not be verified. The hunt was over. The case was cold. The Who was a complete and total void. All that was left was the why. The files were closed. The Who was a ghost. But the why, the psychological signature of this ghost, is all over the evidence. This is our specialty. We must now conduct a psychological autopsy of the assailant using the FBI agent persona. We are not looking for a name. We are looking for a mind. Payoff seed number 1, the psychology of the light bulbs, the signature. Let's return to the hallway. The unscrewed light bulbs. This is the signature of an organized predator. This is not the act of a disorganized assailant, someone who strikes in a frenzy, an impulse. This is not the act of a runaway. This is a cold, cognitive crime. The assailant has a fantasy, and he is planning how to execute it. The act of unscrewing the bulbs tells us he is not a blitz attacker. He is a stalker and a trapper. He is a stalker. He has been watching Lorene. He knows her apartment, her routine. He has surveilled the building. He is a trapper. He is manipulating the environment to his advantage. He is setting the stage. This act reveals a mind that is patient, methodical, and detached. He is not angry. He is hunting. The darkness is his primary weapon. It ensures his victim is disoriented and that he himself cannot be identified by any other tenant who might open their door. Payoff seed #2, the psychology of the sleeping witness, the targeting. Now, let's analyze the why of the victim choice. Why Lorene and not Sherry? A disorganized assailant would have entered and attacked both girls. A crime of opportunity would have resulted in a double slaying or a double abduction. The fact that Sherry was left untouched means only one thing. Lorene was the specific, exclusive target. The assailant came for her. This reinforces the stalker profile. He had a pre-selected victim. This was not random. This was personal. He had, in his mind, already selected Lorene. This also explains the silent abduction. He may have known her. He may have been a con man, a predator who had groomed her. He could have entered the apartment, woken her gently, and whispered, It's me. Come on, don't wake your friend." A 14-year-old girl, disoriented, perhaps still groggy from alcohol, might comply with a person she recognizes, or a person who has already established a psychological control over her. The scene is one of a trapper executing his plan on a targeted victim. Payoff Seed 3, the psychology of the phone calls, the taunting. This is the core of the psychological profile. The calls to California and the silent calls at 3:45 a.m. Let's divide this. The California calls. If Lorene made these calls herself, it suggests she was being groomed by someone in California and was planning to meet them. This fits the compliant abduction theory. The assailant was a con man, a groomer, who convinced her to come with him. If the assailant made these calls, it's an act of pure, cold-blooded misdirection. He is planting a false flag, the runaway theory, to send the police on a wild goose chase across the country, while he, perhaps, is still local. The 3:45 a.m. silent calls. This is the signature of a narcissistic, power-assertive assailant. The work, the abduction, is over. This is the trophy. This is not a cry for help from Lorene. A victim does not get access to a phone repeatedly at the exact same early morning hour only to stay silent. This is the assailant. He is revisiting the crime. He is, in his mind, re-entering Judith Rand's home. He is asserting his power. Think of the psychological thrill he gets. He is safe, anonymous, in the dark. He dials the number. He hears the panic in Judith's voice. "Hello, Lorene?" He is feeding on her hope and her terror. He is in complete control. He is the ghost in her machine. This is a form of psychological torture, and it is the signature of an individual who gets his thrill from the control and the fear he creates long after the physical act is over. The final profile. When we combine the seeds, a terrifying mind emerges. We are looking for an organized, narcissistic predator. He is a stalker who targets, grooms, and plans. He is cold, cognitive, and methodical, the light bulbs. He is not a blitz attacker. He is a con man who likely lured Lorene out of the apartment. And he is a sadist. Not necessarily a physical sadist, but a psychological one, who uses the telephone as a weapon to taunt his victim's family, proving his superiority and reliving his victory. The aftermath of Lorene Rahn's disappearance is the story of the B-plot, Judith Rahn, and her life sentence of ambiguity. The case went cold. For over 40 years, she has been left with only those seeds, the memory of an open door, the knowledge of the unscrewed light bulbs, and the chilling echo of those 3:45 a.m. phone calls. In 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed photo of what Lorene might look like today, in her 50s. The hunt, on paper, is still active. But the trail is gone. The case of Lorene Rahn is a profound reflection on the nature of psychological evidence. This crime was clean of forensics. There was no DNA, no blood, no fingerprints. The only evidence left behind was psychological. The assailant left his fingerprints on the light bulbs. He left his voice in the silent phone calls. He left his profile in the friend who was left sleeping. This was not a whodunit. This was a whydunit and a howdunit. It was a case of a meticulous, organized predator who controlled every element of the scene. The haunting echo of this case is and will always be the sound of that open, silent line. It is the sound of a predator sitting in the dark, somewhere on the other side of the country, or perhaps just down the street. It is the sound of a void, a 40-year-long question mark, and the sound of a mother waiting for an answer that will never come. Thank you for listening to True Crime is Sleepy.
And so, with the final whispered confession of a broken narcissist, our first anthology on the psychological turning point comes to a close. The files are now closed. The analysis is complete. The why has been explored. And now the world outside fades away. The only mystery left is rest. It is time to let the darkness be a comfort, and to let your mind be still. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Good night and sleep well, sleepy detectives.